to our speaker, Professor Timothy Scott Brown. Is Professor of History at Northeastern University. He received his BA, MA, and PhD from Berkeley. His work focuses on 20th century German and transatlantic political and cultural history, radical mass movements, popular music and youth subcultures, the revolt of 1968, and environmental politics. His work over the last decade has been at the forefront, in my opinion, of arguing for a shift from a national to a transnational and thus truly global approach to how we study 1968. This is reflected in the titles of his major publications. For example, he's the author of West Germany in the Global 60s, The Anti-Authoritarian Revolt, 1962 to 1978, which is out with Cambridge University Press, 2013. And that's a book that you can pick up in the Sheldon's foyer there. And I'm sure that Tim would be happy to sign it also if you wanted an autograph. He's also the author of a forthcoming book called 60s Europe, also with Cambridge. In addition, he's also the author of an earlier book called Weimar Radicals. Weimar is sort of Germany in the 1920s. Nazis and Communists Between Authenticity and Performance, which is out with Barkham Books in 2009. Timothy Brown has also edited The Global 60s in Sound and Vision, Media Counterculture Revolt, out with Palgrave, and Between the Avant-Garde and the Everyday, Subversive Politics in Europe, 1957 to the Present. So the titles alone sort of suggest a strong through line in his work around the question of revolutions in various parts around the globe. Professor Brown's essays have appeared in top journals such as the American Historical Review, the Journal of Social History, German Studies Review, the 60s, the Journal of History, Politics and Culture, and Contemporary European History, as well as in a number of highly visible edited volumes. Professor Brown has also received a number of prestigious awards and honors, including the American Council of Learned Societies Fellowship, not one but 2 Fulbright Fellowships, and the Berlin Prize of the American Academy in Berlin. As he's working on finishing his 60s Europe book, he's also already at work on a new project entitled The Greening of Cold War Germany, Environmentalism and Social Movements Across the Wall and Beyond, 1968 to 1989. And astonishingly, he does all of this high-caliber scholarly work while continuing to pursue his love of music. As a member of Hard Left, even though he doesn't want me to play this right now, I really want to play a song right now. A hard-mocked punk band, the founding of which was born out of a desire to explore leftist political ideas and marry them to rabble-rousing music worthy of the worldwide struggle against capital, as their Bandcamp website states. I'm a fan of the band, so I've listened to their records. It's quite good. And on our way from Omaha to Lincoln yesterday evening after a quick beer, I confess that I became even more impressed with Tim, if not even a little bit envious, when he casually pointed out that in 1997, the band that he played with at the time had opened in London for the great Scottish masters of so-called post-rock, Mogwai, in my opinion, the best band in the last 20 years. So, kudos. But before my introduction turns into a fanboy chat about great contemporary rock music, let's start right here and welcome Professor Timothy Scott Brown, whose lecture is entitled, Is Revolution Still Possible? The Crisis of Capitalism and the Meaning of 1968.
Thanks, Marco, for that very kind and slightly embarrassing introduction. I was glad to have received this kind invitation of Marco and Roland and the rest of the organizing committee to give the opening lecture in this year's Humanities on the Edge lecture series. And given the work that I've done, I found the theme of post-revolutionary futures particularly alluring, and was very happy to accept. And I've called my talk, Is Revolution Still Possible? And promised to talk about the student rebellion of 1968, and also I promised that I might also talk about 1917 That was not advertised, so in case I need to back out of it, but I have no reason to back out of it because it's actually very important. And I think if we're going to consider the question of whether we live in a post-revolutionary future or in the face of post-revolutionary futures, we need to understand something about the revolutionary past. And of course, the Bolshevik Revolution, led by Lenin and others to overthrow Tsarism, was second only to the French Revolution of 1789 as the most important of these past revolutions. And we might say, sort of to begin, that the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 and the uprisings of 1968 represent different conceptions of revolution. And I like to think of the history of revolutionary movements and revolutions in terms of revolutionary dilemmas, what I call revolutionary dilemmas, that is, the questions that have to be answered in every revolutionary epoch. And this focus allows us to examine the fractures in revolutionary projects, to examine the competing tendencies, key questions, and debates. And it seems that many of these key questions and debates keep returning and appear in all revolutions. So what are some of these historically? Well, one of the most important is the question of who is the revolutionary subject. The revolutionary subject, that is, the revolutionary subject is the person or class that makes the revolution. And one of the questions that's connected to this is the question of whether the revolution has a class basis, and if it does, what is that class? Is there a revolutionary class? Another question, can a small group of determined militants make a revolution on behalf of that class? Or is a revolution carried out in some manner by the masses themselves, and if so, how? Is there a role for a revolutionary party, a vanguard party like the Bolsheviks? Can elections be involved in a revolutionary process? What is the role of violence? Is self-defense permitted? What about offensive violence? These sorts of conflicts have deep historical roots. Now, in some cases, they can be reduced to a conflict between socialism and communism on the one side and anarchism on the other side. And this is a conflict that stretches back to the 19th century in the disagreements between Karl Marx and Mikhail Bakunin in the First International. Mikhail Bakunin is, of course, the famous Russian anarchist. And this debate was also mirrored in the Russian Revolution in conflict between the Bolsheviks and the Ukrainian anarchist movement led by Mr. Makhno, and also in the well-known Kronstadt Uprising. And this was the moment in which, in 1921, in the midst of the Civil War that broke out after the Revolution, the revolutionary sailors in the Baltic Sea naval base Kronstadt revolted against the Bolsheviks. They revolted against the Bolsheviks from the left. They revolted against the Red Terror that the Bolsheviks had instituted in the course of the Civil War, against forced requisitioning, against strike breaking, against the workers in Petrograd, and also the Bolsheviks' efforts to stop trade between the cities and the countryside, because many of the sailors, the overwhelming majority of the sailors and soldiers were themselves peasants, and so there's a bunch of things that they weren't happy about. Anarchism was also very strong in Spain in the Spanish Revolution of 1936. And here we have a very strong anarchist trade union, the CNT, which was connected with an affinity group called the FAI. So if you see pictures from that era, you can see CNT FAI on armored. And the Spanish Civil War sees a conflict between the Communist Party that's backed by the Soviet Union, the Spanish anarchist, and also the Socialist Party in Spain. And there's a voluminous literature on these behind-the-line struggles. George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia is the most well-known of these. So after 1917, after the Bolshevik Revolution, there's three broad tendencies, we could say. To keep it simple, there's social democracy, which continues to exist in a form since the 19th century. There's communism, and there's anarchism. And after 1917, social democratic parties in Europe have to decide whether they're going to try to form Bolshevik-style parties, communist parties, or whether they're going to stay as social democratic parties. Social democracy had already decided on sort of an evolutionary approach to the revolution. So to decide that you're going to form a communist party meant that you're going to try to speed up the wheels of history and do something like the Bolsheviks did in Russia. So the result of this is that social democratic parties split, and the rump social democratic parties remained social democrats, and then there were these new communist parties. In this conflict between anarchism and communism, we can think of in terms of a bottom-up approach and a top-down approach. The Bolsheviks believe in a top-down, centralized approach, and the anarchists believe, like the CNT FAI in Spain, that the way to make the revolution is to organize workers at the level of the shop floor and delegate their authority upwards, rather than having their authority imposed from the top down by the Revolutionary Party. Now, in the post-1945 period, these conflicts and dilemmas are renewed. There's still the question of parties, state power, but now we have new actors on the scene, beginning in the 1950s and especially in the 1960s, which are artistic avant-garde groups, also youth in general, the idea of the creation of the teenager in the 1940s and 50s, and youth culture. This is a new phenomenon and raises new revolutionary questions. For example, was rock and roll a revolutionary force? Was the sexual revolution a revolution? What role does identity play? What about class? And so, again, in the uprisings that break out in the United States and in Europe on both sides of the Iron Curtain, there's a new question about who the revolutionary subject is. And in this talk, I'll show a couple of posters that were made by the so-called Atelier Populaire in May 1968. The students at the art school produced a bunch of revolutionary posters that are very well known. And this one is Beauty is in the Street. And it depicts an image that never would have appeared in the propaganda of the interwar period, which is a beautiful young woman who is also a revolutionary militant who's taking part in the street fighting. And so it captures a little bit of these new concerns about beauty, sexuality, youth culture, and the connection of those things to revolution. So we have the term 1968, and this afternoon we were able to talk about terminology a little bit, and I won't go too into depth about that, but usually for Americans, the date 1968 conjures visions of social unrest centered on a series of big events that took place in the year 1968. These were, the twin assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy, the Tet Offensive, in which the Viet Cong shot the American forces in Vietnam, and also the police riot at the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago. And if we understand the term 1968 a little more capaciously, to refer not just to the year 1968, but to a broader complex of events, we would include, for America, the founding of Students for Democratic Society, which was the most important student radical organization in the United States, which produced in 1962 their founding document, which was the Port Huron Statement. And in the Port Huron Statement, they called for, a resurgence of participatory democracy and called for attempts to solve problems like the Cold War arms race and continued racial injustice in America. And there was also the emergence over this longer span of more militant groups like the Black Panthers, Marxist-Leninist groups like Progressive Labor, the Weathermen terrorist group, and also eventually the women's movement, the gay rights movement, and so on. Now in Europe, 1968 is associated with May 68 in Paris, and also to a lesser extent with the so-called Prague Spring. And you'll recall that the Prague Spring was when the Communist Party in Czechoslovakia tried to institute a socialism with a human face, and then this was crushed by the Soviets, who didn't want socialism to have a human face, as it were. So Scholars have identified 1968 in all the countries of Europe, including those in Eastern Europe. And increasingly now scholars are also working on the Third World, as it was called at the time, or the Global South, as we usually refer to it now. So we've had to open up the timeline more and more because 1968 is not the key date in many places. In some countries, key events take place in the 1970s or they take place earlier. So we've also talked in terms of a global 1968, the long 1960s. You know, there's different terminology that's sort of been invented to capture this in a little more detail to get away from the idea that everything happened in 1968, which it did not. So how did 1968 differ from earlier moments of radical rupture, from earlier revolutions? So we need to make an important distinction first here between the so-called old left and the new left. We use the term the new left to describe the new movements that become prominent in the 1960s. And so if there's a new left, there has to also be an old left. So what is the old left? Well, the old left is basically, it's a term that pertains to the classical workers' movements of the period before 1945, to the interwar period, and going back into the 19th century. So the distinction between the old left and the new left is that the old left functions in a classically Marxist mode. It's focused on factory workers, the industrial proletariat. It's focused especially on men, on male factory workers, whereas the new left is driven by youth and by students in particular. They differ also in their social location because the old left is centered in factories in some ways, also in the street, obviously, and the new left is centered in the universities and also in the street. They have different analytical lenses and they have different concerns. So whereas the old left concerns itself with the class struggle in the classical Marxist sense, as the need for those who are forced to sell their labor power to survive, the proletariat, to seize the means of production. And the new left is based on new actors and new assumptions. So what are some of those? Well, first of all, a first assumption of the new left is that 1917 failed, that the Russian Revolution failed. I will qualify this, Marco. That is that the state begun by Lenin and continued by Stalin was, by the 1960s, no longer revolutionary in any meaningful sense of the word. Now, Trotskyists, the followers of Leon Trotsky, could quibble that it was not their man who had sold out the revolution, that was Stalin. But either way, the Soviet Union was no longer the place to which one looked as an example. And this was, of course, not the position of the communist parties in countries like France and Italy, the old guard communist parties who were still in the Bolshevik tradition. And this presaged a key conflict in 1968 between these communist parties and the student movements. You would think at first glance the communist parties in France and Italy, for example, would back the rebellion of the young rebels who were revitalized by aspects of the Marxist tradition, but this was not the case. This conflict was especially noticeable in France, where the French Communist Party shunned the student movement, leading one of that movement's key leaders, Daniel Cohn-Bendit, to write a critique of Bolshevism, both historical and contemporary, which basically condemned Bolshevism as a counter-revolutionary movement that seized power and instituted one-party dictatorship, and therefore buried the revolution rather than protected it. And so, in his book, he talks again about the Kronstadt rebellion, which is one of the classic historical incidents that's used to make the case that the Bolsheviks are a counter-revolutionary rather than a revolutionary movement. And this claim was important in other countries as well, as in West Germany, which is the country that I work on the most. And you can see here an announcement of a special conference on Kronstadt in the radical journal Agit Drei, and it says, smash this, it says smash the state, all the power to the proletariat, all of Macht den Räten, all power to the councils, which in the Soviet context would be the Soviets, against capitalism and against Bolshevism. anarchism rather than Bolshevism. So the 60s are a moment of a strong resurgence of interest in anarchism, and this whole thing around the Kronstadt revolt was important for them. Now, the official New Left with a capital N and a capital L was launched in England, especially over the question of the crimes of Stalinism. Stalin had died in 1953, and you probably remember that in 1956, in his secret speech, which wasn't secret, Khrushchev revealed the crimes of Stalinism, admitted that Stalin had murdered millions of people and had done all these things. The same year, the Soviet Union invaded Hungary and smashed the sort of budding democracy movement there. So the New Left is a response of British intellectuals, many of whom broke with communist parties because of this and tried to find a new way to, make Marxism relevant for a new generation. Then this idea that starts, that really is crystallized in 56 is really reinforced in 1968, because 1968 is the year that the Soviets invade the Warsaw Pact countries invade Czechoslovakia and crush the Prague Spring. Now, there was a move within 1968 to recover Bolshevism as a meaningful tradition, and we'll come back to this. But this relates to a basic fact of 1968, a claim that I frequently make, is that there is no one 1968. 68 is a matter of multiple revolutions, sometimes complementary and sometimes competing. So a second key assumption about the New Left was that the proletariat, the working class, was no longer revolutionary. Now, obviously, some workers were more radical than others. In France, for example, the student radicalism of May '68 took place against the backdrop of a massive general strike that saw millions of workers out on strike and temporarily shaking the French state to its foundations. Workers were extremely militant in Italy as well. In West Germany, not so much, for historical reasons. But whatever the situation in individual countries, it was generally the case that workers no longer belonged to a putatively unitary class that was being so immiserated as to make revolution inevitable. Karl Marx had posited the idea of a proletariat, that it is this class that's created by industrialization, that was impoverished and immiserated by industrialization and had to sell its labor power to survive. But by the 1950s and 1960s, workers were not uniformly confined to shabby tenements and deprived of basic necessities as they had been in the 1920s and 1930s. This was a period, as the British historian Arthur Marwick has pointed out, in which amenities such as washing machines, automobiles, and television sets became widely available, and the prospects of working class life markedly improved. It goes without saying that rising prosperity did not take workers out of their conditions of exploitation. They were still forced to sell their labor power while the owners of capital pocketed the profit from their labor, but the relative satisfaction of working classes presented radicals with a problem. Who would make the revolution if the exploited classes were no longer interested in the revolution? And this image, which is either the image or a similar image to the one that's on the French theorist Guy Debord's book, Society of the Spectacle, it was used in the cover of that book to suggest the situationist analysis of the situation that I've just described, because Debord posited the idea that modern society, that the commodity form that Marx had talked about, had reached its ultimate state in the kind of society of the spectacle in which people were completely removed from the realities of their life and just lived inside kind of a shop window, as it were. For radicals who were convinced that relative prosperity did not obviate the need for revolution, especially in view of the socially oppressive conditions that accompanied this prosperity in the 1950s and 60s. This is a time of repressive social mores and expectations of conformity to Cold War categories, fierce anti-communism, and so on. The attention of these groups who still wanted a revolution had to focus on groups that might still have an interest in upsetting the status quo. In other words, if the factory workers don't want to rebel, and again, that's an oversimplification, but widely true, we have to look to new groups. So who are the new groups? Well, the new groups would be students, because this is a time of rapid expansion of universities and access to higher education. It could be artists, especially radical artists working in the European tradition of avant-garde artists who are involved in politics. It could be youth subcultures, and it could be so-called marginal groups. And the German-American theorist Huron was very influential for the student movement, and he posited the idea of the marginal group made up of people like juvenile delinquents, bohemian nonconformists like the Beats, and people like that who could in some way represent a revolutionary force. And part of the idea was that the intrusion of youth subcultures and people who wouldn't conform to bourgeois values represented a revolutionary stirring of the pot. The British underground newspaper International Times published an article by their Berlin correspondent in which this picture appeared, which captures something of that, the reception of youth subcultures in the so-called beat wave of the 1960s, when rock and roll was becoming, seemed to be, in a way, a social force that was threatening to the status quo. So the thinking went that these marginal groups, or students, artists, subcultures, were groups that either, A, possessed the critical analysis to see past this glowing window of consumer capitalism to the alienation that it concealed, or B, they were so marginalized as to not be able to take part in it, and so desperate as to have no allegiance to it. And this also included, from Marcuse, the national liberation struggles of the Third World, the guerrillas in Vietnam and elsewhere, who were directly fighting capitalism in the form of fighting imperialism with weapons. So 1968, the New Left is driven by new actors, but it also has new concerns and new methods. It was an uprising of youth and intelligentsia, also sometimes workers. It was against the Cold War. It was in favor of decolonization and self-determination for formerly colonized people. It was in favor of participatory democracy, that is, not just democracy as voting in elections, but democracy as in making decisions about your own life in cooperation with other people around you. It was bottom up, not top down, and this pertains to participatory democracy as well as to questions of organization, and it connected the dots. I would say the single most important thing about 68 is it connects the dots. You've all heard the phrase sometimes meant as a criticism of a movement being a single issue movement. Well, the 60s are not a single issue movement. They're not a set of single issue movements. The movements of 68 are multi-issue movements that insist that every type of oppression is linked to every other type of oppression, and they all have to be fought together. So I've described 1968 in terms of a convergence followed by a divergence. So the convergence is, in the 1950s and early 1960s, in West Germany, for example, which is the country that I've done the most work on, there's a bunch of people who are opposed to the Cold War, who are opposed to German rearmament, who are opposed to nuclear weapons in German soil, people in the peace movement, trade unions, the Christian clergy. They come together in the early 1960s with people who were radical avant-garde artists, student radicals in the German STS, German Socialist German Students League, and they become a broad movement that has kind of revolutionary expectations, and this is referred to in Germany as the extra-parliamentary opposition, because the Social Democratic Party, the SPD, goes into government with conservatives in the mid-1960s, and so radicals feel that they no longer have representation in parliament, so they form an extra-parliamentary opposition. After 1968, some of their main goals don't work out. I'll talk about those in a moment. And these groups all diverge, and they diverge into some new forms, like the women's movement, the Back to the Land movement, the countercultural movement of hippies, very much on the American model. They diverge into terror groups. They diverge into groups that try to found new little communist parties, the so-called K-Gruppen in West Germany, to try to go back to the workers and make the revolution that should have been intended all along, and so on and so forth. And the flavor of that moment, the rise of the K-Gruppen, comes across in this image of one of their demonstrations. And you can see they've got pictures of Mao, who's extremely important for them, and also Lenin, and you can even see Stalin in there. So there's an attempt to go back to revolutionary basics, and these groups are influential for a while, but they're also marginalized because they're dogmatic sectarian groups. And also in this case, you can see they're sort of blended with countercultural style as well, because this is the early 70s at this point. So the question we have here in the wake of this convergence and divergence is, what are we to make of a revolution or a radical moment in which no one actually seizes power? And what's important about '68, first, is this democratic renewal that I talked about before. And also there's a focus on consciousness and on information and on what I call the politics of knowledge. The Frankfurt School intellectuals like Adorno and Horkheimer and also Marcuse had worried about what they called the culture industry, which was the way in which capital shaped the ability of people to even think about their situation. And Marcuse had also used that, used the term of the consciousness industry, which makes the point even more strongly. And students in 1968 protested precisely against the operation of this culture or consciousness industry. And they argued that it prevented revolution because it prevented people from knowing their true situation. So one of the things they protested against was the Springer Press in West Germany, which is kind of like the West German Rupert Murdoch, I guess you could say. And you can see in this image that outside the student organization here, you see the student depicted as this biker barbarian, and the citizen wants to know if he can go to the football now, if he can go to the soccer game now, or are they still riding there as well? And this is at a time when the students are, wearing ties, right? Like it's the mid-60s. They don't look like this in any way. So this is just one small example of what the students claimed was an anti-democratic system of using mendacious images that were lies, basically, to marginalize the student movement and separate them from the population. And there's a wonderful image from May '68, again from the Atelier Populaire, which says the radio lies. And this is, this claim is made in connection specifically with the way the May '68 revolts are being treated on the radio, but it's also a metaphor for a broader, critique of the media and the media's role in capitalism. And I would say what they diagnosed then is much worse today than it was 40 years ago. I think that's clear. We have a problem, however, because now we talk about the role of social media, like for example in the Arab Spring, or the use of Facebook, to spread subversive memes or whatever. But we don't really have any clear evidence that improved communications, i.e. the internet, are giving rise to some sort of Aufklärung or enlightenment in the sense that the student movement would have wished. The German-American philosopher Herbert Marcuse had posited the idea of repressive tolerance. This is very important for him. In other words, that capitalism didn't have to openly repress people, but they would permit them to say anything they wanted, and then it wouldn't matter. And one wonders if his idea of repressive tolerance in some way is expressive of this situation. But I will say that in the 60s, and this is Rainer Langhans of the infamous Kommune 1 in West Berlin, the first commune, who were the sort of people who started the radical, situationist-inspired subversive practices that helped create a counterculture in West Berlin and so on. But what he's doing in this picture is he's using a rotoprint machine to produce, subversive literature from the communal ice. In part, they were doing bootleg publishing of all kinds of works that had not been previously available, like The Function of the Orgasm by Wilhelm Reich, and all kinds of books of the Frankfurt School, all the revolutionary writings of the past that had been suppressed under the Nazis 20 years previously. These people reprint them and sell them or make them otherwise available. And they also produce their own literature dealing with their psychological theories and so on and so forth. And I would say that this activity is a characteristic activity of 1968, the creation of knowledge from below, the alternative press, and it's also true of all revolutionary movements. There's a huge outpouring of written material in historical revolutionary movements in 1848, in 1917, or obviously in 1789 as well. So, the theorist Frederick Jameson once wrote, quote, "Someone once said that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism," unquote. And Marco referred to this idea earlier, and it was always central to Marx's thought that real existing conditions would produce their own solutions. After all, Marx believed that capitalism would have to spread through the entire world, destroying old ways of life and revolutionizing human existence. Marx believed that capitalism was a revolutionary force, and it was only after capitalism had enacted its revolution that the proletariat would be able to enact its revolution. Now, the Bolsheviks and others decided that they needed to speed up this process, and no one expected the Russian Revolution to take place in backwards Russia, with an overwhelmingly peasant population. People thought that if a revolution in the Marxist model occurred in Europe, that it would occur in Germany, an advanced country with an organized industrial proletariat. But this is not what happened. That Marx believed that capitalism would have to do what I would say capitalism is doing now, spreading throughout the entire world and upsetting traditional ways of life before it would reach the point at which the proletarian revolution would be possible. He also predicted that this would cause widespread misery. And now, as brutal conditions of work that used to exist in the West are exported to the global South, this becomes a prophecy in a way, and in their place of origin, we are left with, in many cases, unemployment, the so-called opioid crisis in the United States, and so on and so forth. So there's been a lot of scholarship recently about capitalism and the crisis of capitalism, which I included in that phrase in the title of my talk. And Jefferson Cowie and Nick Salvatore recently pointed out that the period during which the student movements of the 60s took place, the period that came sort of at the end of the New Deal period, was really only this blip in the historical radar. And this also is a period of liberalism at home, which is conjoined with massive violence in Vietnam and elsewhere on the part of the same liberal administrations, right? But their argument is that this period of kind and gentle capitalism in the 1950s and 1960s that begins to end at the beginning of the 1970s is in fact a blip in the historical radar. So if there was a Gilded Age, we use the phrase the Gilded Age, of maximum exploitation in the decades leading up to the turn of the last century, and if we are now in what the centrist liberal commentator Paul Krugman calls a new Gilded Age, it doesn't take much of a leap of the imagination to realize that capitalism is always at least striving to be a Gilded Age, an age of maximum exploitation with no checks on the right or the ability of a certain class to extract profit from another. Now, the German sociologist Wolfgang Streeck pointed out recently in his book, How Will Capitalism End?, that even the link between capitalism and democracy that we take for granted is very tenuous at best. And of course, we know that capitalism and authoritarianism exist very well in Russia and China and Latin American dictatorships over the past several decades. And Streeck argues that this association between capitalism and democracy is only really powerful in the interwar period between 1919 and 1933. So if it were the case, as some might suggest, that we are now seeing the rise of a hollowed out sham democracy as a facade for corporate rule, protected by a heavily militarized police force, then it makes us think about the old Comintern definition of fascism as, quote, the open terroristic dictatorship of the most reactionary, most chauvinistic, and most imperialist elements of finance capital. Now, that definition has received a lot of criticism because it's kind of this vulgar Marxist interpretation of the link between capitalism and fascism. Nevertheless, one's mind, under certain circumstances, can be called to, can return to it. So if with the old left, we had a situation of mass poverty, think back to the Industrial Revolution, the Manchester, that Engels saw and that Marx wrote about. This social question that was produced by the Industrial Revolution, and with the new left, we have a post-materialist term made possible by rising prosperity. You probably all heard the term post-materialism to denote this period in which people like student radicals in the 60s can embrace new concerns because they know that they will have a job or they can go off to the Peace Corps or whatever. Very different than students feel nowadays, I think. If we think about this, if we have this old left and this new left that is post-materialist, which produces a cultural revolution, which succeeds at that, but fails to produce a political revolution, what do we have now in a post-materialist society in which ever greater wealth is concentrated into fewer and fewer hands? Now, Occupy Wall Street, a while back, put class back on the agenda with its idea of a 99% facing a super rich 1%. And Occupy has been criticized for its tactics, and one criticism, of course, has been that if you can't occupy a place in the face of state power, if you can't not be expelled from Zuccotti Park, et cetera, then you haven't actually occupied anything. But they did put this issue, class, back on the agenda. And they also put on the agenda, or they at least call attention to the fact that protest is no longer enough for the left, but rather that organization is key, which is something that they were accused of lacking. Now, identity has been used as a weapon against class in recent history. And in truth, the two are not in opposition. We saw this problem in the recent electoral campaign with the myth of the so-called Bernie bro. And this is really nothing less than an attempt to use a learned-over identity politics to smear anyone who's attempting to assert a class perspective. And it goes against the facts of the matter because Bernie Sanders had many, many supporters among minorities and women. But I've been charged, by the organizers with the task of considering what in these revolutionary traditions that I've discussed is still relevant for today. And I guess I don't agree with the organizers if, in positing the idea of a post-revolutionary future, they mean to suggest that revolution is no longer possible. Although, don't ask me, when it will come or what form it will take. But I think about Naomi Klein's recent book about the climate crisis, in which she suggested that climate change could force a reckoning with capitalism and that all the revolutionary movements of the past were unable to accomplish. Now, would such a reckoning be a revolutionary one, or would it be an evolutionary one? I don't really have an answer to the question that Marco raised about the idea of thinking outside, the boundaries of the present. I mean, I think a little bit about Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist who was imprisoned under Mussolini, and his influential idea of hegemony, that is the process by which the ruling class is able to do precisely what Marco was talking about, which is make it impossible to think outside of the boundaries of the current situation. And this is in fact something that's done by the creation of common sense. In Gramsci's telling, common sense is created that dictates that, for example, revolution could not be possible, right? I just wanted to say that, well, first of all, just since I put this image up, I'll say something quick about it. This is in 1968 in West Berlin, and it says state of emergency, and it has 1848, which of course are the Europe-wide revolutions of 1848. It has 1968, and it also has 1933. And the reason in the German context that it has 1933 is because that's the year that the Nazis come to power and declare a state of emergency, right? So there is a dialectical relationship between the threat from fascism and the birth and emergence of left-wing movements, which we don't really have time to get into today, but Marco, in his preliminary conversation with me, made reference to an essay of Toulouse in which he suggested that May 68 did not take place. May 68 did not take place. And he meant this in the sense that 1968 did not fail, indeed could not fail, because it was not a set of empirical events as much as a temporary eruption of a potential inherent in modern society that returns again and again. What is this potential? I would say it's the sudden recognition, driven mostly but not entirely by the young, that they have problems that can't be named, that they share these problems with others, and that they can struggle together to solve these problems on the basis of solidarity, comradeship, and truthfulness. 68 and moments like it is when the ghost of social revolution past reappears. People see each other in the street, maybe even talk. It's when the printing presses start up, manned by young people and some older people who suddenly realize they have something urgent to say. And it's when, for a moment at least, nobody really believes the cant that normally governs social relations. It's sort of when a window opens up in which everyone is suddenly paying attention. And in that moment, the possibility of utopia suddenly appears. And this is kind of captured nicely in this image from the Atelier Populaire, which says, of course, return to normal. And the normal is being sheep, right? And it's just interesting because they saw the moment that they were living through as this moment of some sort of utopian outbreak that wasn't normal. And of course, we were discussing earlier today about how that moment can never last. It always has to fade back into the normal. But I would look at 68 as one of these historical moments in which there's something that's not normal that happens that then can be returned to, and that not normal thing is sort of what I just described. So I would locate the meaning of 1968 precisely here. 1968 was against the Cold War, it was against the arms race, it was against the madness of the mutually assured destruction doctrine, according to which all powers in a nuclear conflict would be destroyed. It was against imperialism. It sought to recover lost revolutionary traditions and invent new ones. It made missteps, it was incomplete, it couldn't always figure out what was valuable in the old revolutionary traditions. It couldn't bridge the gap between a political movement to change society and a countercultural movement to drop out of society. It became unduly enamored of third world liberation movements that were themselves not particularly democratic. It was uncritical about things like Maoism, and it's no surprise that the former 68ers who are most embarrassed and most trying to distance themselves from their previous actions were the Maoists. The anarchists aren't trying to distance themselves from being an anarchist, just saying. It was uncritical about things like Maoism, and it struggled to accommodate the voices of women, gays, and minorities. But 1968 was an opening. It sought to name the problems, to connect the dots, and to struggle collectively for solutions. And it was a moment when a bunch of separate streams became, for a little while, a raging torrent. Now, there's a famous story in which the Chinese premier, Zhou Enlai, was asked in 1972 what he made of the French Revolution. And Zhou said, too early to tell. Now, this is such a good story that I wanted to have it in my book, but I realized that it's actually apocryphal, because apparently there was a mistranslation, and Zhou was talking about 1968. It was too early to tell what the meaning of 1968 was. But I think his wonderful quote works both ways, because it is in some ways, sadly, still early to tell, too early to tell what the outcome of the French Revolution is, but it's definitely, as a historian, too early to tell what 1968 means, but I've made a little bit of a foray into that for you today, so I hope that was interesting.